Tired of being lied to about politics, the economy, world affairs, and national security? Find out what's really going on and why it matters. Thought-provoking news, timely insights, and critical commentary. Point Blank with Sam Kephart. The power of candor in an age of deceit.
The world is confronted with several pressing issues today, quite frankly, not the least of which are the most recent election results here in the United States. Donald Trump, the billionaire real estate developer and mogul from New York, defeated Hillary Clinton, our former Secretary of State here in the United States, for president-elect, to be the new president of the United States. And there were almost diametrically opposed, 180 degrees off, points of view for the direction of the United States. And each candidate roughly had about 45% or thereabouts of the popular vote. And so as a result, there's a significant division psychologically and direction-wise right at the moment here in the United States. Now, I'm of the opinion that the direction we were on under the 8 years of the Obama administration and prospectively under the continuation of that to some degree with a Clinton administration was the wrong approach. So I supported Donald Trump, but not the least of which were for some foreign policy reasons, which I'll get into in a minute. So anyhow, since the United States arguably, for better for worse, is quote unquote the leader of the free world, I think the implications and the downstream derivations of what this election means to domestic policy, economic policy, social policy in the United States, and its effects on other countries. Moving to Europe, the first thing that's a huge consideration for me is the fact that the London and Wall Street derivatives mess, which we all know about from 2007, 2008, when these huge multi-billion-dollar bets or gambles were made that brought the market down about 8 years ago. Well, here's the sad thing, folks. Those underlying derivative issues not only have not been properly dealt with, but there's now roughly 8 or 9 times the number of derivatives that there were in 07, 08. So not only was the casino mentality amongst the commercial banks and the Wall Street companies a bad idea, it's now 8 or 9 times bigger. So not only was it not fixed, it's a bigger balloon than it was before. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve. And of course, you have the central banks in London and in Europe. And essentially, they pumped a lot of money into the system. And the concept behind the pumping of the money, the liquidity as they call it, or the printing of the money and putting that money into the banking system, essentially, the purpose of that was to re-liquefy, meaning make it easier for small business and individual consumers to get credit. Well, the banks, who were the in-between people to distribute that money to the consumers and the small business people, essentially they took the bulk of that almost free money, the loans they take on a wholesale basis from their respective central bankers. They took that money and instead went back to the casino. So we have this casino offshore where these derivatives are being gambled back and forth, and they took all that money and made the gamble now roughly 8 or 9 times bigger. So I think that's a huge issue that needs to be addressed because it's a ticking time bomb, and it has not been adequately solved or put to bed. Moving a little further east, we have the issue in the Middle East. Right now, we have a war in Syria, but we also have great instability in Iraq still, in Afghanistan, and in multiple countries in the Middle East. And the American policy of going in and having regime change has really not worked out. And in fairness to President Obama, that has been a concept of regime change is really laid at the feet of the neocons. And the neocons, that's a buzzword for the continuation of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his final speech before he turned the reins over to President Kennedy back in 1960. So, in any event, the neocon regime change perpetual war scheme in the Middle East has not worked. How do I know? Well, just look at it. There's not a single regime change or country that we've stuck our nose in or attacked militarily where we've been able to stand up a proper democracy after the fact. We've made things worse in every single case without exception. So that brings it forward to Syria right now, which is a major item on the news, and there's a civil war there. And there's a couple layers to this. Basically, the neocons here in the United States, and Hillary Clinton was in favor of this, want to confront Vladimir Putin and Putin's Russia. Russia, of course, has been supportive of Syria since the middle 60s. And basically, President Assad of Syria, his father, another Assad, the original President Assad, was a client state, if you will, of Russia. So these folks have been close and in bed from a foreign policy and economic standpoint and oil standpoint with Russia, basically for 50 years or so. And so now you have the United States and England. One of the critical things here that has not been made clear to the public is that there are two competing gas lines. Russia supplies right now today roughly 35 to 40% of the natural gas supply to several major Western European countries like France, Italy, parts of Germany, and so on. Fine. The gas has been flowing for years. It's a nice steady supply. Russia has lots of energy to sell, so there's no problem there. But the Brits and the Americans really don't like the idea that from a strategic standpoint and from a financial standpoint that Russia has A, that much control, and B, that much financial revenue coming from that. So now they want to build a competing gas line. Well, guess what? Both gas lines need to cross the country of Syria. And we have a graphic that you'll see here, and it basically lets you see in one picture what the core problem is, and yet you've never, ever seen this picture on any of the major news networks. So I would challenge you, why is that? And frankly, that's why the tagline for this show, Point Blank, is the power of candor, straight talk, in an age of deceit. And the deceit is you're not being told the truth about why all this stuff is happening in Syria. That's part of this equation as to why there's a war there. And the other part is that the United States and certain of the NATO allies want to have a much bigger war, God forbid World War III, because when you have a big war, you can then use the bonded indebtedness and the need for war material from the cranking up of the industrial military complex to offset and attempt to hide some of the misbehavior and malfeasance that's gone on in the derivatives market. So there is no good outcome here. And the whole thing of demonizing Vladimir Putin's leadership and basically putting sanctions on Russia, it's not a clean deal. They're doing it as a manipulation and a perpetration, not to really advance any overall healing in the Middle East. And frankly, that was one of the key reasons I supported Donald Trump. Donald Trump has stated that he will work with Putin to reshape Middle East policy and critical geopolitical issues elsewhere in the world. I believe that. I think they will be able to come to a working methodology. And I much prefer that to the perpetual war and the regime change scheme, which the neocons, the military-industrial complex, has been pursuing for 15 or 20 years, and it simply doesn't work. Moving on further, we have another emerging giant, of course, is the economics of China. And China, now that they have benefited mightily over the last 40 years from doing business with the United States, and so many of our consumer goods come from China, that China has enriched itself to the tune of a couple $1 trillion, trillion with a T. And now that they have this liquidity, of course, the Chinese people indigenous to the country, their middle class wants and needs are going up. But more importantly, China now has the money and the power to field a pretty significant military. So they're building up their presence in the South China Sea. And if you look at a map, which we have here of the South China Sea, you can see that there are major shipping routes. Well, if you think about most of the electronics and computers and consumer goods that are made either in China or Southeast Asia, something on the order of about 65 or 70%, so roughly 2/3 of all those goods, those high-value goods, cross through the South China Sea. And the United States, pretty much since World War II, has had dominance of the Western Pacific. You know, we have a fleet that's headquartered out of San Diego and Pearl Harbor and formerly in the Philippines. And that fleet really dominated the sea lanes and protected the sea lanes of Asia and Southeast Asia. Well, now you have China building submarines. They're building huge underground facilities for those submarines. They're building artificial islands, which they're then declaring their territory because there's X number of miles, arguably from 10 or 12 out to 200, so they can extend their sea or maritime territory. You have a potentially very explosive situation coming up in with China and the whole Southeast Asia, because you have this burgeoning middle class coming from the benefit of the last 35 or 40 years of American money going over there. And now you got everybody kind of feeling their oats, and particularly China with their military capacity and, you know, the buildup of their navy. And then lastly, what I would like to address, and it's a problem both here in the United States and in Europe, but particularly in Europe right now, is the whole immigrant problem. There is a group of socialist economics and political junkies who advise governments who feel that immigration, floods of immigration, can basically be used to cause, for lack of a better expression, political regime change within Western countries. And that if you bring enough migrants in, particularly Muslims, who are not Judeo-Christian, they have a different core religious belief system, but if you can flood Western societies, which are predominantly and historically Judeo-Christian, with hundreds of thousands or millions of Muslims, many of whom do not want to assimilate. They want to keep Sharia law being the law that they have under their own religious system and courts, a religious court, and their beliefs about women being subservient to men and so on. If you bring in hundreds of thousands or millions of indigent Syrian refugees or other Muslim refugees into Western Europe, and here in the United States, it is a disaster waiting to happen. Now, in the United States, it's happened to some degree, but nothing like what has happened in France and in Germany and in England and in Greece. I mean, you've got a real mess over there. I have a friend who is involved in Germany, and he back channels information to me, and it's just god awful. And he really feels that Germany may collapse within the next few years because of the inability to properly handle this influx of migrants. So then you say, well, you know, the German people are being good-hearted and what? No, it isn't about being good-hearted. It's intentional, because they can bring in this element, break up the traditional German society, and then you have a much more chaotic situation that's easier to control the population because everybody's screaming. And people are screaming right now. The average German citizen is fed up and very upset. So that's sort of a very quick spin around the world right now. There's some other things obviously mixing into that, but I think that's a pretty good overview.
Point Blank with Sam Kephart, the power of candor in an age of deceit.